So let's jump into today's topic of Design Corner, which is kind of the iterative process of design. So iteration is something that you hear a lot of uh, when you are talking to anybody about, how do you design basically anything. It doesn't have to be games. It's, products and doing experimentation. Iteration is a common thing that you hear a lot. And it's also something that you often hear described in basically the way it doesn't work a lot of the time, because the way iteration should work, the way iteration does work, and the way iteration theoretically works are all very different things. So, yeah, Havenhart, who I think is a programmer, said the diagram looks very familiar to me. Gets back to testing, and this is a super simplified kind of mock-up. I just literally made in like 90 seconds. I trying to get the curves to not be awful with my mouse in Photoshop was the hardest part. It's this kind of like if you had to put a structure to the what we're doing with Savage Pathfinder and to a certain extent East Texas University Study Abroad, then this is what it would look like. So we're going to talk specifically in the vein of Savage Pathfinder and ETU Study Abroad because those are the two things that I've been experiencing this process with Pinnacle. We're focused on, I hesitate to call it Pinnacle's process because working on two products does not make me an expert on Pinnacle's overall process. But the process I'm experiencing and interacting with you folks with is perhaps the way to describe it. And this is also fairly accurate to my experiences working in video games and mobile games specifically. When you get into larger projects, this tends to be a little bit more of a robust process. But so let's start from the beginning, right? So there's an entire chart in the design portion of the graphic, and there's an entire graphic and multiple design corners on just that part, right? That's why the show is called Design Corner. It's all about figuring out all the elements of design. But really, to start, you start with what are you trying to solve? Basically, is ultimately the design question that you're always trying to answer. In the instance of Savage Pathfinder, it's how do we take the setting of Golarion and the adventure path, Rise of the Rune Lords, and Hollow's Last Hope, and all of the tropes and stereotypes that you would expect to experience in a Pathfinder game, and map that to our rule set, right? And that then turns into a very nuanced question because saying like the setting of Golarion, a lot of the rules of Pathfinder are baked into the setting, right? The example that comes up all the time and is the easiest example is interference with spellcasting, right? If you are an arcane caster, for the most part, besides very specific use cases for very very specific classes and feats and whatnot, wearing armor interferes with your ability to cast spells. Well, that is started. I would assume. I can't say for certain. I was not there, but I would assume that that is starting at a design point, right? This is how we're balancing the classes. It's also to a certain degree a legacy element from Dungeons and Dragons and their departure from 3.5. And if you go far back enough in the genealogy, you get to the point where the original discussion is how do we balance the fact that spellcasters get to do all these crazy things with the fact that fighters and whatnot, they just get to hit things with their sword really well. Well, one of the ways is to make the spellcaster squishier. They can't wear armor. And then if you just present a game term, right, just a game mechanic, well, if you're playing a role-playing game, because everything has to kind of make sense within context of the world, the less things that do, the more you have to suspend disbelief, and the harder it is to suspend that disbelief, then we have to present some sort of in-universe justification. So follow that down multiple steps we're doing. Now that's an element of the setting as well as the rules, and so we kind of have to adapt both. But so that's the brief, is we are going to design what the Savage Worlds version of Pathfinder looks like. And then we basically go through this process just internally, right? Okay, first question, which I think literally was the first question because it's the elephant in the room. should Savage Pathfinder have classes, right? Well, that's a lot of discussion, right? Which is part of the design process of just talking out, what are the pros and cons. I remember one of the first things I did, because I was in the camp of, because there was not immediate consensus, right? And for good reason. But I was in the camp of, well, if we want it to feel like Pathfinder, if we want to feel like you're playing kind of the same game just in a different way, I this is the first time I've had this thought, but I don't know that it's hyper inaccurate. To a certain degree, I think we want the game to. It's like playing on a video game on a PlayStation or an Xbox, right? Maybe a PC versus a console would be a better analogy to draw. But we want you to feel like you played the same game, but it was with the controls and the settings and the interface that you're most comfortable with, right? So if you like your double thumbsticks, as I do, I love playing first person shooters on controller more than mouse and keyboard, then I can do so. If I prefer the mouse and keyboard, I can jump over to mouse and keyboard. That's kind of the thing that we are thinking of and talking about when it comes to that original design brief. One of the first points that I brought up, because I was in we should probably have some facsimile of classes, was let me go to the Pathfinder subreddit and look at what are the last 100 topics, right? If I sort by most popular, so the most popular last 100 topics that have been posted to the John Doom, don't start. I don't want people to start bickering about controller versus keyboard. I got enough of that working in video games. But and you've thrown me off my groove. So the last 100 most popular things from the Pathfinder subreddit, right? Which, you have to bake in a couple of caveats there, right? A, the people that are talking about it on the subreddit are a fraction of the community. They're the portion of the community that is online, which is not the entire community. They're the portion of the community that enjoys talking about the game in addition to playing it, which is a smaller fraction of the community. And also something that is very true of talking about tabletop role-playing games online is you have a higher percentage of people who don't play the game talking about it online because they don't have anybody to play with, right? This is becoming less and less true as time goes on, as virtual games and whatnot become more common and everybody's jumping onto VTTs. But still, there's a substantive portion of the folks online that don't play the game, so they talk about it because they wish they were playing the game. So we have to break onto all those caveats. But if we look at the last 100 on the subreddit at the time I did this, which was, time has no meaning anymore. I think like if I had realized I was going to use this example, I probably would have dug up the old email thread. But I think it was something like 30 to 50% of the topics on the subreddit were folks talking about issues with classes, class builds, subclasses they want to see, different ways to break the game using classes, asking advice for how to do their class builds, and asking for like, what is the best class to do X thing. I've got a narrative notion. I want somebody to help me figure out the mechanics of it. And so, that's kind of going through the discussion process. And that was kind of my version of basically getting feedback, right? Because we can talk a lot about, what do we think? But if we look at what does the community say, right? In this instance, what is how important are classes to the Pathfinder community? We see pretty important. And the whole point is to give Savage Worlds players an experience of something that they otherwise don't get in Savage Worlds. Another point, right? But then we start talking about the cons. But so we go through that process of we're basically building our initial draft and the assumptions that we're going to start with. And then the next thing we did after we had basically a skeleton of the rules, right? Basically, the point at which we had the first draft of the iconics. So we had done enough rules work to add some powers, but I think that first playtest, we just had basically the library that we'd pulled in from other stuff, right? So like some epic power modifiers from the Fantasy Companion, some stuff from the superpower, the Supers Companion. Basically, the first pass of like these are some things that we can do to exemplify more spells from Pathfinder. Then some additional edges for the class edges. The first iteration of armor restriction, which I think was, I don't know if the first version of the rules that you folks saw, maybe in the previews you would have seen this version because we showed off the paladin and whatnot. But back when it was based on your minimum strength, which very quickly was not robust enough to actually do what we wanted it to do, and also kind of made people care about something that they, generally speaking, when playing a game, didn't care about. But all of those elements, and Mike had done, as we talked about, I think before, the kind of the first level passive. I'm taking this thing from Pathfinder and putting it in Savage Worlds, which is as much to a 1-to-1 conversion as you can possibly do. Right? There's a lot of design work that comes in of how do I translate this so it feels the same, because the 1-to-1 translation doesn't make it feel the same, you know? And then we started playtesting, right? And I think the very first time was I played the druid, and Simon was playing the paladin, Shane was playing the rogue, Carl was playing the cleric, and Chris was playing the sorcerer, I think. But so we get to that first step, right? We've done a bunch of design. Now we test it. And it's at this point where we stayed in this kind of first loop for, again, time has very little meaning. It had to have been at least two. I'm going to give you a big range because I honestly am horrible with time and don't remember. It was like 2 to 6 months. I think 2 to 4 is a slightly more accurate range if I remember correctly. But last year, and so we were in that cycle of we've done some design, let's test it in the play test. Okay, did our expectations line up with how it was working? Okay, let's do some more design. And one of the things that you can do when you have a design team, right? This is something that as your team scales up, it becomes easier to do, and is the value of a design team is we often can skip the test part, right? Especially, when we're not a team independent of Peg working on this thing and having to constantly check in with Peg, right? Shane and Simon are in all of the meetings, right? So it's fairly easy. And then eventually, Clint, when the rules were at enough of a point that we started, expanding the circle of people talking about it was useful. But they know how the system should work, right? We're not having to do any sort of that discovery. We know what our baseline, like this is, how Savage Worlds should play. And so you don't necessarily need to go through and test every single thing. For example, a lot of the sorcerer backgrounds, right? They're the sorcerer bloodlines. We don't really need to have somebody play every single bloodline. We don't need to have somebody play every single domain of cleric. We don't need to have somebody use every single new power in playtesting. Ideally, right, with enough money, time, resources, and staff, that is actually the best approach, right, is to literally test everything and have data that supports everything. But that is an outlay of expense that literally I think no one in this industry does, right? I don't even think you could realistically say that Wizards of the Coast has every single element of their design tested by playtesters and have data that shows that it's fun. It's a significant portion of it has to come from understanding your audience, your design, and what will work. And basically, I hate to use this term just because it has some negative connotations, but basically do the theory crafting behind it, right? You can do a lot of design before it ever gets in anybody's hands and identify what's going to work and what's not. If you want some tips on how to identify problem designs, then go to last week's video on YouTube. So we go through that process a bunch, and then we hit the point where you folks start getting involved, which is the release stage. And this is the point where basically, and you know, like Haven Heart said, that's what you have us for. That's one of the things that you know, we're not beholden to a publisher, right? If I was giving this talk about working in AAA video games, the publisher does not want the community to see the game in the way it won't be played in the final, because that theoretically negatively impacts sales, because people will see a version of the game that is not the version the PR folks are trying to sell to the audience. So that's why, you know, if you ever play a, you know, AAA video game and they have a beta, it's not actually a beta, it's a stress test. Beta is feature complete but not content complete, and they're usually only a couple months from gold at that point. They're well past what beta is, right? If you ever played a alpha game in alpha, most likely it's actually in beta, because alpha is you are not feature complete. So, but we don't have that stricture. We can share with you folks directly and have evolving designs that, well, Haven Heart video games do understand betas. They just don't use the marketing folks don't use the right terms when talking to the community. But we don't have we can show you folks a design and then be like, actually, this design isn't the thing that we're going to finally land on, because now we're seeing a lot of other people play with it, getting a lot more data and information. Okay, sorry, I just got a I have to immediately look when I get a Hangouts ping, because that's work stuff. Oh, I got another one. Okay. I'm sorry, that threw me off my groove. But yeah, so we can go through and expose designs, and that helps us stress test, right, in a way that we would not be able to just internally. You know, it's taken us many months, and we are in book 5 of Rise of the Runelords, I think, at this point. I think we're in book 5. Through our, like, let's play test it linearly. I think not this week, but next week, we are going to jump ahead and test the final boss fight in book 6, and have made up some legendary rank characters for that. But that's been, you know, this kind of hodgepodge experience of playing with different characters with different different builds, different ancestries, constantly swapping all the time, right? Often basically between encounters sometimes, because we're trying to simultaneously test the encounters plus test the edges that we're introducing and the new powers and all those things, and see what those combinations look like. So we're constantly making new characters. There's this running joke in the playtest that none of the NPCs know who we are, because one party will go into, you know, the fort or the dungeon or start the investigation, and a different party will come out the other side. And even that is a very narrow slice of ultimately what we can test. And there's the other element that, and we talked about this on, I think, multiple design corners at this point. We can write something and understand what we mean by it, but until somebody who's read it in a vacuum understands it, we don't actually know with data that in the way we intended it to be read is the way that it is actually read. And so that's the other thing that the feedback is super useful for, is just making sure that as presented, it makes sense, right? That's also something else that is very common in video games. You spend a lot of time working on what's called your first time user experience, which is like the first 5 to 10 minutes of the game, in which ideally you hook the player with your gameplay and you keep them playing for the other, you know, 20, 40, 60, 100 hours, whatever it might be. And you expose them to why your game is fun. And you spend a lot of time crafting that, so that way everything is easy to understand, and that they pick, you know, the player picks up the controls, and the tutorial doesn't take 10 years to run through. And the harder your first time user experience is to get through, the more you get people to bounce off and just stop playing the game. We kind of have that, but everywhere, right? Every single rule, when the first time you read the rule in a vacuum without knowing all of the idea behind it and the intention behind it, does it land the way that is intended? Those are kind of the two really big things that we get in the feedback process. And Landauer just said that we have just passed 100 hours of streamed content on the Peg Twitch, and that number will only continue to go up as we have other cool things for you folks to check out. So here's your obligatory, if you like the stuff we're doing, don't forget to follow, so that way you get notifications when our live streams are live. And also, I recommend following us on some sort of social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or signing up for the weekly newsletter, so that way you know in advance of the streams what's going to happen. Honestly, the Tuesday newsletter is the best way to keep up and track with everything that we're doing, because all the news goes in there. But so now we're at the point where we're getting all this feedback, and then there's a couple of things that happen. So one, there is the general impression that you can get from reading the volume of feedback, right? And this is not diving down into every single thread and reading every single line and comparing them, right? That, I mean, you can do that, but that in that way lies madness, trying to hold all of the impressions in your head. But basically, I look at this slice of the community, somebody else looks at this slice, and it's a very natural thing. It's where do you tend to go, right? I like the forum, I like Twitter, I like, interacting with you folks in the Twitch chat. So those are the places where I kind of start to get an impression of where the community's at, right? Shane's very much on Facebook and in the Facebook group. I think also, like a lot of the, how to say this charitably, the old timers at PEG are the Facebook crowd. I'm gonna get a nasty look from somebody in the Monday meeting, I am sure. I think Mike, there's forums that Mike goes to that I'm not a part of them. I'm kind of the Reddit guy, so if you're on the subreddit, I'm probably seeing your stuff, and Clint will to a certain extent. But I think I'm the only like native Redditor on the team. I might be, well, I mean, Landauer too, but I'm thinking specifically of the Pathfinder dev team. But so we all kind of get this impression of what is the community reaction to a lot of things, and that helps you identify as a designer, right? Okay, the community, we have this kind of macro impression of what the community is experiencing, what they're talking about, what kind of the buzz is. That then can inform what do we specifically pay a lot of attention to, right? If a lot yeah, on my final design corner, John Doom, as I think is appropriate for his username, prophetizing my doom. Yeah, hey, listen, as of this Saturday, I'm inoculated 2 weeks past my second COVID shot, so that chances of me kicking the bucket drastically go down. So maybe John Doom won't be right. But now that we got kind of this large impression, we can look specifically at the things both people like and what people don't like, right? Both are incredibly valuable. So, okay, a lot of people, like when we started exposing the spellcasting stuff, there was a lot of things that people really liked that we were doing. Okay, why do they like that? What element of that design are they latching onto and really enjoying, right? For some folks, it's the expanded options that we have, right? For other folks, it's the fact that they can see how they can do all the Pathfinder spells, but they inherently have more freedom to kind of do their own thing and have that extra imagination. For some folks, it was, oh man, cantrips sound really cool, and I'm excited to have that because that's never been a tool that I've had before in Savage Worlds, at least not in the same way. Knowing the things that people like and the way that we've designed it, we tend to design other things more like that, right? depending on the presentation and the original design of it, making more things like the things that people like, which is a lot of likes in a single sentence, is a great way to continue to make your community happy with the design, right? And also it helps us identify what are the parts where like people just get it, right? We don't need to re-explain this. We don't need to reword this. When we explain something like X, people get it and we can move on, right? Because that's a super valuable understanding what language works with our community is, I mean, again, I say understanding. For people like me that are newer to the team and newer to the community, it's a much more robust learning process than say for somebody like Shane who's been writing for this community for over 25 years at this point, and has a pretty good finger on the pulse of what the audience likes. Boiler Sargar asked, and as always, I haven't said it yet this episode, but as always, folks, if you have a question about something as we go through, just throw it out there. And if I don't get to it while we're talking, then I will get to it before the end. But Abuelo Sargar asked, if we have feedback about specific rule element that isn't a typo, omission, error, where do we post that? So I've got two answers. It kind of depends on what you're looking for. So if, for the most part, you can probably just still put it in the new release feedback section of the forum of like, I think it should work like this. That's generally going to be good for the, hey, I don't think you've thought about how these two things interact. You probably want to do X. That's fine to go in there. If you don't like something and you want to more kind of see, are you the only one? Or you don't necessarily have an alternative idea, but you want to start talking about it with other folks, then that goes in the Rusty Dragon section of the forums where folks will jump in and talk about it, right? And again, it's it's a useful thing to see how many people don't like a rule or are struggling with the interpretation. Or alternatively, as I've seen many times, somebody posts in the Rusty Dragon with something that they don't like, and then 5 or 6 other people jump in, that have nothing to do with the design, that are just other members of the community, and say, well, but you didn't think about all these things, and this is why that's actually not a problem. And I honestly, I find those to be the most insightful things for me to come across, because that is not soliciting, hey, do you understand this thing? Which is a very bad way to find out if somebody understands something. But seeing, okay, did they explain it correctly? Well, that's super valuable, right? But also saying, wait, they explained it incorrectly. Both of those are super valuable, because now you see kind of more empirically than if you just ask them, what does the rule mean? Whether or not they get it. And if they do, then okay, that rule, we're probably good on that rule. People are understanding it, getting it, they're seeing the value. If not, then either A, the rule doesn't feel as cool as it isn't actually as cool as we thought it was going to be, or the way we've presented it doesn't make it seem as cool and as understandable and easy to use as we thought. So we've got to go in and modify and monkey with that. Alternatively, people will jump in and talk about how they don't like it, and that again is valuable feedback. One of the things that this is a very tricky subject when it comes to designers, and I've met professional designers with decades of experience that still haven't really figured out how to handle feedback. And it is that there is a dividing line between only accepting feedback that draws the conclusion you want it to, which is bad, and knowing what feedback doesn't actually hit the mark. And so what I mean by that is sometimes somebody will give feedback on something, and their feedback is predicated on an incorrect notion of what the rule is, what the design is. In that instance, you're pretty safe to mostly ignore that feedback, right? I can't think of necessarily a good example off the top of my head, but it's things like basically they thought the rule was supposed to do X, it actually does Y, and they're responding to it doing X, not responding to it doing Y, right? That's kind of, I'm not drawing a good example from Savage Pathfinder to pull out from. I haven't seen a lot of this. In instances I have fairly minor, so that they don't stick out in my head. But basically, it'd be like saying, okay, I think the rule that you've so let's take a let's take let's just make up an example. I can probably navigate through that faster than I can think up of something I've seen. So say when we were talking about shield facing, right? Say somebody responded to the like Havenheart, like the armor discussion is fairly robust, but it's not really, people get the rule, they just don't necessarily agree with it. But let's say somebody was responding to the shield facing thing that we did, right? Where you get, if people are attacking on you on the same action card, then you only get your shield parry bonus to half of those people. And if they said that, okay, this rule doesn't make any sense because as we go through initiative and more enemies step up to attack me, it changes the number of people I can block against. And somebody attacking me on a different turn, I could potentially get not my parry bonus against, even though they've technically attacked me after everybody else, and I could have changed my shield, right? And so this is, and I've got whatever solution to solve that. Just get rid of the rule. The rule is bad. Get rid of the rule. In that instance, they've not understood the rule, so you can ignore 90% of the feedback, right? And you're not ignoring it because, oh, I think it's a good rule, and so I'm going to ignore anybody that says otherwise. You're ignoring it because they're responding to a completely different argument, right? Everybody's had the experience of that's an interesting thought, Sargar. We'll touch on that in a second. But everybody's probably had this experience online of, you get into a debate with somebody, or probably more realistically, an argument with somebody, and they start responding to things that you weren't saying because they've started kind of assuming your point and what you're going to be saying. That's kind of what you're dealing with, right? And generally speaking, if you're in an argument with somebody and they start doing that, you kind of start to get the impression that they're probably not arguing in good faith, and you really should just cut it off because they just want to talk at you until you say that they are right, not actually convince you of anything or be convinced of anything. Well, that's kind of the thing that you're interacting with there is it's not actually feedback on the thing, it's feedback on what they think it is. But the important point, the thing that you cannot ignore, the last 10%, which that 10% is more important than the other 90, is the fact that they got the rule wrong. Now, sometimes it's just people will get the rule wrong no matter how well you explain it. That's fine. But sometimes it's because the rule is not written as straightforward as it should be, or the way the rule interacts with the other systems is not as seamless or well thought out or whatever as you originally intended the design to be. So you need to address that. But again, this is the thing that this makes it very difficult even for experienced designers to really grab is, you have to have a clear notion that is why you were ignoring that feedback. It's very easy to get into the kind of the pace of, I'm going to ignore this because who cares? I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to ignore that. And not to critically think about each individual piece of feedback that you get that you're actually like diving into and think about, why am I ignoring this feedback? It's very easy to get into I'm just going to ignore it because I've got too many things to do. Well, if you're sitting down and actually reading this feedback and trying to take it in versus it being kind of the sea of feedback that you're getting, then you need to evaluate, why am I taking this feedback? Why am I ignoring this feedback? And that last 10% becomes then very, very important. And you also have to figure out, and this is what volume is very useful for, if one person tells me that they don't understand the rule, then one person didn't understand the rule. There's an old adage that goes, if you went through your day and you met an asshole, you met an asshole. If you went through your entire day meeting nothing but assholes, you're the asshole. It's kind of the same thing. If one person doesn't understand the rule, 2 people, 3 people, depending on how many responses you're getting, then that's just kind of the cost of doing business. If 10 people, 20 people don't understand the rule, it's now probably the problem is the rule or the context it's set in or the fact that you don't have an example. And now okay, we need to go and fix that. So that kind of stuff is all happening throughout the feedback process, right? You're having your general impressions, which is very useful to have a team for, because you get people that go to different places and you can get a much greater breadth of the community. And then you dive down into specific points of feedback to understand why people are saying what they're saying, why they like what they like, why they don't like what they like, how common is it? Are people responding to your rules because they understand the rule and there's a problem with the design? Or are they responding to the rule that they think it is, and thus there's an issue with your presentation? All of those elements. That's all happening throughout the feedback process. And that's the type of stuff that results in a meeting, right? Typically speaking. There are these elements that we either need to refine the design or redo the presentation, or sometimes even just decide. People have said it could work A or B. Which way do we want it to work? Right? Sometimes the misinterpretation of how the rule works, you have to ask yourself, is that how we want the rule to work? Because it's not unreasonable to draw either conclusion. So we kind of just have to choose which one do we like more. And then there's the kind of the other side of the feedback, which is especially in books like this, right? You don't really get this in like video games, but you do get this in this. Is okay, you missed a comma here, you missed a period here, the pronoun usage is unclear here, the spacing got screwed up here, and the half the column is on the left hand with the header, and then on the right hand there's no header, but there's two headers on the left. I was just reading that piece of feedback before we did this. And that's kind of in previous design corners when I talked about how most of the feedback we're getting at this point is bookkeeping. That's what I'm talking about, right? It's the something got screwed up along the way, or somebody didn't catch something. I think a big area where this comes in is we're trying to squeeze a little bit more text into the same amount of space, and so we've got to cut things here and move things around. And that process, yeah, you missed as Haven Hart said, you missed a semicolon at the end of the line. That's a C# programmer for you. I'm now questioning. It's been so long since I programmed. That's just Haven Hart confirmed for me. That's a C# thing, right? All of those things, right? That's a lot of work. It's what I call non-controversial feedback. It's you're 100% right. There should be a period there, and occasionally in that you do get like this person doesn't like commas as much as we do, or actually it's generally the reverse is they like commas more than we do. They say there should be a comma here, but you don't actually need a comma there. So there's a little bit of that stuff that you can just kind of skip over. Haven Hart said, "I am correct. That is C#." I as a small, I'll do the aside later. As a small aside, I was making a custom skill list in Foundry VTT, and so I was all of a sudden catapulted 5 years into the past when I was writing JSON objects, because that's how I needed to import a new skill list. So there's all that bookkeeping that you have to do, and that's something that in this instance, it ends up in a spreadsheet because that seems the most logical place to put it in, because then you can mark off it has been dealt with. You can put page number and the section that it's in, and all that stuff, so that way you can easily track it. And also that then generates it's an easy way to make like a change log, as we do, so that way folks know what is different. And then somebody goes through it. In this instance, it's me, the feedback forum, and looks at all of the non-controversial issues people are brought up. And I go through the extra onus of I go to the book and double check. Also because we don't necessarily have a super robust and it would largely be pointless because people wouldn't follow it anyway. We don't have like here's a template for you to give us your bug report in. That'd be at that point we're treating you like QA, which would be a little weird. But some people just write feedback, and it's like, thank you to the folks that give page numbers. Sometimes folks don't give page numbers, and I have to do a bunch of hunting. But so it's collating all of that, putting it together, and then passing that on to whoever needs to actually do the implementation of the book. which could be basically anybody on the team, depending on what's being implemented and who's touching what at any given point in time. And then we do that again, right? We add all that stuff. We continue to test. Usually in there's the conversation that we have that we cover all of the kind of controversial design things. Again, we're also at the point where like half of the controversial design meeting is just we got to choose A or B that we want to have happen, and we balance the pros and cons. And again, that's another valuable thing about having the team is the more people you have up to a certain point. Eventually, you have too many people for it to be useful, but you're going to think about a different con than I'm going to think of, and maybe that thing that I'm putting up as a pro, you're going to think of as not so much a pro. And we go through that process, and that's at this point like half the stuff is just like A, B, which one do we want to go with, and then there's other things where it's an actual problem, and we need to just come up with a solution to this problem, right? That's the kind of process that we went through. I mean, again, most of the stuff is like the closest thing you could probably say to that is the spellcasting changes that we've done, but even then, that was, as I described in that other design corner, less of a like, this is a problem we need to solve, and more of a we've oversolved the problem. Let's dial it a step back and see how it plays. And then we did that, right? We're once again back in that little design and test loop. At the point where I think it was the first version of the rules went out, we were already kind of halfway to let's, shut up, turn a bunch of the, as I say, undo a bunch of the levers and revert some of the changes in spellcasting. We were 75% of the way there when that rule went out, when the version went out, and then people responded, and then by the time we got to the release of the next version, we were again 75% of the way to just chucking the rest of the levers, right? With things like getting spell points back on bennies. And basically, and obviously I can't speak to, well, I can kind of speak to this with study abroad because that's out the door. Eventually, and this is true for basically any creative endeavor, you run out of time is basically how it works. The book has to go to the printer at some point. The rules have to be final at some point. We could go through this process basically for the rest of our lives and never actually land at a final design. I've seen it on longer projects. People be in one camp at the start of a project, right, on a design issue, and then over the course of working on the project, by the time we get to the end, they are in the other camp. And not necessarily because they've been convinced by the people in that camp, but just by their attitudes have shifted and their perspective has shifted. And, given a long enough project, like they change. And so they are now not the designer that would be in camp A. They're now the designer that would be in camp B. And so eventually you have to say, enough's enough. It's done. Sending the book out the door. And so basically, yeah, this will be the process as far as I'm aware until we're like, okay, it's done. We've got to send the book to the printer so that way the printer can print it, so that way they can ship it to the fulfillment center, so the fulfillment center can ship it to you. So let's scroll up because Abuelo Sargar had a to confirm, because Abuelo Sargar said the specific feedback I have is much an opinion, not so much an issue with this rule. Again, that's one of those things where the more we see people's opinions on a thing, I would probably do the Rusty Dragon, just because for us, then seeing the people who agree and disagree with you is more points of data that's valuable for us. But again, new release is also fine. I'm gonna read it either way probably. But Abuelo Sargar also brought up a point. Speaking of shields, I ruled that the shield doesn't protect against a swarm, which elicited some boos, but I felt it was the correct interpretation of how a swarm works. Actually, let me refresh my memory on the swarm rules, which I have the book open, so it should be relatively easy to do. I think you're just straight up right if I remember the way swarms work, because they should just deal damage in the square, and the parry never really comes into it, if I'm remembering correctly. Where are you, swarm? S for swarm. Yeah. Swarms hit automatically unless shaken and cause 2d4 damage to everyone in the template, or whatever damage is listed for that specific instantiation of the swarm. So yeah, I don't. No amount of parry is going to make the shield any more effective. Now, you know, specific mileage might vary. You might be able to say there's a small opening and I stick my shield in the opening so that way they literally can't get out of the space, but that's more situational and tactical than it is just, you know, a shield working or not. So yeah, it doesn't matter how much parry bonus you get from your shield. To a certain degree, depending on how much armor you're wearing, eventually it starts to, if you're completely sealed in a suit of armor, which I forget. Back when we were working, I was playtesting Holland's Last Hope with my group. I could have told you whether or not the full plate mail counted as fully encapsulated, but I don't remember at the moment. But yeah, that sounds right to me. Yeah, so Havenheart brings up in ways that made sense coming from D20, but I'm liking how the classes are evening out unless this class is getting punished for being good at X. And that is something that's one of those things that, we realistically it's the default assumption you should go in with. But the how to phrase this? It shouldn't be surprising to anybody that making classes by balancing positively is better than balancing negatively, right? It's always better to give a buff than a nerf. Eventually you run into kind of basically the power inflation of a game if all you ever do is buff people to bring them up in level, right? If you play any sort of MOBA or battle royale game, things like Apex Legends, Overwatch, Dota, League of Legends, so on and so forth, if you only ever buff characters to make them more powerful, to bring them up in line with everybody else, then the variances in, oh, maybe this character got buffed a little too much. Well, now we got to buff this character. We got to buff this character and this character and now this character. And it just, you climb the ladder. That can be something to watch out for. But again, on just, thinking through it, yeah, folks are going to like it if you make them better at something to explain, why they're good at X, rather than making everybody else bad at that thing. And that's, I think, a good example of one of those instances where, things like the Wizard Spellbook, right? It was basically just a hindrance a couple of versions ago. And we were seeing people's responses to other things we had done to capture the flavor of other classes and how they were in the positive. It was like, oh yeah, why don't we make it a cool thing? So yeah, I think the monk, I believe Sargar says that he doesn't feel the monk, they feel the monk is not ready for prime time, needs some form of innate parry or defense for survivability, and a better model for classic D&D/Pathfinder monks. Well, yeah, I think that's one element of the conversation we're going to have today. It's one of the things that we're continuing to kind of fine tune and testing. Part of it is the notion of where a character will be over the course of a combat. So right now, the current thinking is, so if a fighter starts here, right? They're the baseline. The fighter starts here, and they're basically always here, right? They're always going to be able to take that free combat edge, and generally speaking, what edges they're going to take depending on the section of the adventure path that you're in, right? When you get to the point where you're fighting a bunch of giants, you're probably going to take giant killer all the time. And then classes like the paladin or the monk, right? The martial classes with the mystic powers, kind of the current design thinking is, well, they're going to start here, but as we go through combat rounds, they're going to continue to increase in power because they have a little bit of ramp up time, right? So the paladin on the first round, they might do a little less damage than the fighter because they don't have deadly blows. Is it called? I think it gives you extra damage. Well, on their first round, limited free action, they spend 2 of their power points to cast Major Smite. So now they're here, and now they're basically in parity with the fighter. But the fighter was a little bit better that first round, or maybe they're a little bit below. And then the next round, the paladin then casts protection, and so now they're a little bit tougher, and so now maybe they've eked out over the fighter. That doesn't help the paladin if combat ends in the first round, which it certainly can in Savage Worlds. But as combats go longer, right, as you get into basically what are the knockdown, like the big fights, like the entire dungeon has descended on us. I've always been, and this is the way I've always done dungeon crawls, is that once you start a fight in the dungeon, the rest of the dungeon shows up to the fight, and that's very much the philosophy for any dungeons that we have in Rise of the Runelords. Is once you start fighting somebody, everybody else starts to hear, and they start to show up and attack you from behind and use the secret passage to get at you, and so on and so forth. And so what might have otherwise been 4 or 5 discrete fights is now one big fight, and that takes more time because you've now got more extras and wild cards acting, and it's taking more rounds. But that gives the paladins the opportunity to ramp up, right? So a fight that might have been 1 or 2 rounds, period, now it's maybe 3 or 4 rounds, maybe even 5. That's still, I think, fairly long for our encounters. But by the time you get to that point, the paladin is now every round wailing on folks better than the fighter did. That's the balance there. With the monk, I think we've narrowed that gap, but I think probably the problem that we still have, and we need to address a little bit, is the monk right now is probably starting further down than, say, like the paladin, and they don't get as far high up. It would be fine if this was the gulf between the paladin and the fighter, but by round 4, it's this, and the monk is just demolishing people, right? They've got a very long charge up time, right? Which would be, kind of funnily appropriate for the monk and kind of a Dragon Ball Z charging up Spirit Bomb kind of not Spirit Bomb. I don't know what. Well, I mean, Spirit Bomb took forever to charge up, but kind of Super Saiyan notion of 2 episodes later, okay, you punch the guy and he's dead in 1 hit. That's certainly a way to go, but there's probably the dials need more adjusting. So yeah, I think we've covered kind of what the process looks like, the value at each stage of the process. Do folks have any questions? And also, if you have questions that aren't necessarily on the topic, but other spend box 1 and 2 screaming. I mean, that I'm sure you could take a hindrance. Yeah, you could just take the major habit hindrance and you just scream. I mean, like I said, a certain point, that's basically Tourette syndrome. Abuela Sargar asks, how's the bestiary coming along? I am wonderfully ignorant of how the bestiary is coming along because I ain't working on it, and I'm glad I've got enough things to work on. So I mean, it's coming along. Yeah, that's I think a Mike question at this point. Yeah, a Mike or a Simon question. I don't 100%. I think it's still Mike. But I think the bestiary is, well, I can safely say this. The bestiary is closer to coming out than it is to when we started working on it as a blank document. that's largely useless information. You would hope that it's closer to it's kind of like what's the Cleopatra is closer to the modern is closer to the modern day than she was to the pyramids. That's the answer I got as far as the bestiary is concerned. Um, I cherish my ignorance on the subject. I've got enough other books to work on. So there is no reason why we have to go straight to 3. We can end a few minutes early if we've sufficiently covered the topic and folks don't have other Pathfinder adjacent questions. So normally this is the point in the show where I would be telling you what the topic for next week is going to be. Soon, TM. However, remember that thing I said about having enough books to work on and being busy enough? So Design Corner, spoiler alert, was never really intended to be this hard and fast weekly show. I'm gonna pause that to address what Havenheart just asked. When casting a power, do you expend a power point on a crit fail? I don't remember reading it. Yeah, it's on all failed activations. You still spend a single power point. That should be in the activation section. I don't know that we call out losing the power point in both failure and critical failure, but I think that's kind of the understanding is that both stack. But it should be an activation as opposed to critical failure. But so Design Corner was never really meant to be a weekly show. It was a weekly show because we needed X amount of streamed content on the Peg Twitch to maintain the where we are on the partner affiliate, whatever. I think we're affiliate, whatever we are. But now we're at the point where Landauer and the folks have enough cool stuff in the pipe that we don't have to do Design Corner every single week, which is good because Design Corner is best when there is a problem that we've encountered working on Savage Worlds for us to talk about, right? Things like the shield facing or reviewing, the latest release or talking to Sean about converting systems and settings and whatnot. So Design Corner is going to, now that there's other shows coming up the pipe and we don't need the time hours, we're gonna and that I am incredibly busy and have books to work on. We are going to be swapping to a more ad hoc when things come up format. So it's not like we're now bi-weekly. It's we'll do another Design Corner when there's stuff to talk about. So expect to see Design Corners around new book releases and when things come up in the community that are worth talking about, and also whenever we do work and there's an interesting design thing to come and to chew on, because those are honestly the best Design Corners. So the places to keep an eye out are the Tuesday newsletter. If you basically want all the PEG news, that's the best place to get it. You can sign up for it on the PEG Inc. website or follow us on social media, right? Twitter, Instagram, the Facebook group. Probably I could, since we're not going to be doing it every week, I could probably also swing. I didn't pull that up. Landauer has too much power and can also pull up the comments. I could probably now get away with posting about it every time we do an episode in the subreddit, now that it's not a weekly thing. I'm not going to be spamming the subreddit. So basically, any of the social media places for Pinnacle, that's where you'll get early alerts of the next topics and when we're doing the next Design Corners. And I would also expect, unless anybody stops me, definitely for Deadwood, I plan on doing an old Design Corner live from Deadwood. I think next year at the Savage Cruise, the internet might not be good enough. I'm led to believe that the internet is quite abysmal. But if we can work something out, then we'll also do one from the cruise. But basically, if we're going to be at an event, I'm probably going to do a live Design Corner from that event as well. Assuming I'm not, as I'm quite soon about to be buried in books to work on. So yeah, that's it, folks. If at any point you have any questions or anything, you can find me again. You can find me on Twitter, at Donald Schepis on Twitter. You can find me on the subreddit. Probably the best way is to just look through the topics in the subreddit and find the profile picture that looks like me. Or message me on the PEG website, wherever. And until then, I will see you folks the next time we have something interesting to dive into on Design Quarter. So until then.